Good evening, everybody. It's office hours time again. Welcome. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you can see me. Sing out in the chat line if you cannot. I must admit I'm a bit torn at the moment. I'm thrilled that you're here, but I'm also, half of me is going, what are you doing here? It's 2 days before Christmas. Surely you have better things to do than listen to some Australian talk tech. But as I said, I'm very appreciative that you're here, and hopefully we'll have a nice fun hour talking some cool tech content. This is the very last office hours of the year, so it'll be pretty chill, pretty relaxed, and we'll do a couple of things that we traditionally do on the very last office hours of the year. We'll get to that shortly. But yeah, let me share my screen and we'll get everything up and running and we'll get started. Okay. As I always say, getting in touch with me is very easy. The easiest way is just go to that link, linktree/Connor, scan the QR code. Yes, I know it looks absolutely hideous because it's got my ugly mug in the middle, but it is a working QR code. Or just hit me up on Twitter. My DMs are always open. That's if Twitter's up and running. X, or whatever it's called, is down for most of today. But yeah, hopefully other than that, easy to get in touch with me. And we can charge on regardless. As I always say, I would imagine if you're on this office hours, it's not your very first one because you'd have to be keen to arriving at this time of the year. But as I always say, we put the content over to the left and generally down to the bottom such that when we turn it into a video, things will be okay. A few bits and pieces that I like to cover, even though I really can't talk about what's coming up because obviously we're into the holiday period. There's probably not coming up in the near future. One thing I will say is it was 40 degrees Celsius today in Perth, which is 110-ish if you're from that part of the world. And in order not to mess with the audio, I have turned the air conditioning off. And so in this house, as the hour goes on, will get warmer and warmer and warmer. So I apologize in advance that by the end, I'll just be a dripping mess. But I just didn't want to have that sort of dull, droning sound of air conditioning vents going on throughout the entire call. So bear with me as I get glossier as that night goes on. One thing, hopefully, the fact that you're here means you've probably seen our new office hours. We've done a migration to a system which internally is called the Tech Session Planner. And effectively now we've sort of come up with just a more modern interface and hopefully easier to use office hours for all of you people out there. So in the past, it was a little bit sort of vague as to whether you had a session or a series, etc. So now we've sort of improved that. We got any individual session you'll see at the left. If you go to the office hours tab on Ask Tom, if it's part of a series, you can join a series, but you can now choose either to register just for a session or an entire series. Hopefully in register for all of mine. And there's also this new thing called the My Dashboard. So once you sign in, it'll show you everything you've registered for, everything that's coming up, recordings, etc. So all that stuff now is sort of your one-stop shop, easy to find. So hopefully you enjoy the new office hours layout and system. And it's basically what we're moving going forward. So other than that, the office hours sessions themselves will still be the same. All this stuff on the chat, I need to be looking. Someone said, we can do a home swap. It's in Austria, it's 0 degrees. Yeah, so I imagine you won't be sweating there. In terms of, rather than talk about things I'm going to, I just thought I'd spend just a couple of minutes on a couple of quick things. I went to Poland in November, which is why we couldn't have office hours in November. Fantastic event. I went to the UK OEG conference. Once again, a nice event. That there is the ACE dinner. All the Oracle ACEs get invited to have a dinner. So another reason you should join the ACE program. We had that's actually on a boat, a small sort of canal boat. We had a meal there, lovely meal in the UK. And finally, we had the DOAG conference. So they were all pretty much consecutive, like end-on-end conferences, which is why I couldn't run office hours last month. This is a podcast I did with Kai and Caroline at the DOAG conference. If you search for Devs on Tape, the podcast, you'll be able to see some cool recordings there of myself and all sorts of other people. Rather than dwell on things that are coming up next year, because I normally take about 5 or so minutes to talk about events coming up, I thought I'd throw out this in terms of, it's a really good blog post by a good friend named Carrie Millsap. And he did this post just the other day saying 4 great reasons to go to a conference, because most of us can generally name 2, which is the content and the networking. But he came up with that even if you're going to a conference where you're seeing perhaps the same speakers or maybe even the same talks that you might have seen before or stuff that you're familiar with, he quoted this. He said, there's great things to see content even if you've seen it before, to double check the ideas that are still true, see the advancements in those ideas, understand the ideas in more detail. This is a key one, to reinforce that you're not the only person thinking about these things. For many years, my first job was at a mining company here in Perth, and I was using Oracle, and I thought I knew everything. Ego told me that I knew everything it was about Oracle, until I went to a talk by Dave Ensor, who did the 20 most common errors people make, and I ticked off 19 of them. So even if you're just going to see stuff you think you already know, it's amazing how you can broaden your horizons. And obviously to meet people who are interested in the same ideas as you. And he had some more: to hear ideas explained in different ways, to understand ideas in light of new experiences that you might have had or others, to give feedback, to actually have that two-way communication to the person who's giving the talk, and to learn how to explain the ideas better to people. So I wanted to put those out there because please, oops, wrong way. We'll go back one more. Please, if you get a chance, go ahead and go to carrymillsap.com and check that blog post, because what you can do is you can print it out and then send it off to your manager next year when you want to go into an event, because I know that it's hard. All companies are struggling to get travel at the moment. So if you get a chance, basically go, print this out, send it to your manager and say, this is why we should be having face-to-face meetups. And I put there's a Guinness World Record because that's probably the most number of words I've ever put on a slide, but hopefully it's worth the effort. All of this comes to that same old thing, which is support your local user groups. Get along to your local meetups, get along to your local events, and hopefully see if you can travel a bit more broadly as well in order to broaden your perspective and knowledge of what's going on in the community. Now, I've put this slide up because traditionally when we have Ask Tom office hours, what we do is questions come in throughout the month, and I try to turn them into formal answers and formal demos and stuff. But anyone that's been on my office hour sessions for the last, we haven't gone for about 4 years now, the last one of the year, I always throw it open. I have pre-canned content ready to go. I've got, I think, 9 questions came in over the month that I wanted to deal with on the session. However, on the last session of the year, like this one, I always throw up the opportunity for you to hijack the session. So if you have any particular questions that are burning for you, and you don't care what I'm going to talk about, you just want to have your question answered, then assuming it's database related, yes, you can then basically throw it in the chat and it will take precedence. So we'll basically try answer it on the fly and do it live and see how we go. So that's your choices. If you don't have any questions, then we'll just charge on ahead. But as I said, as I cover each one, at the end, we'll go back to the chat. And if you have questions that you would like to divert the talk, this is your chance. You guys are in control of this last session of the year. These are the things that I have come in during the month we don't want to talk about. And so if none of these interest you, then yeah, this is your chance to throw questions on the chat. So the things we're talking about, there you go, straight away one's come in. Okay. Let's answer this one because this will be very easy to answer. Good evening. Do you know when version 23C will be released on Solaris on Spark 64-bit? I would love to say, we give a maniacal laugh and say, yes, I do know, but I refuse to tell you. That would be a lie because I don't walk in the circles high enough up in the echelons of Oracle where I see those decisions being made. One thing I can tell you is my view in terms of releases. We did the developer release for 23C in April. And then we refreshed that in conjunction with the base release on cloud at CloudWorld. That was in September. So that was 23.2 came out in April. 23.3 was the version that then went on cloud and we refreshed our developer release. I would say the next thing would probably be the general release, the general availability for on-premise. And that, I would guess that would be Linux, shortly followed by Windows, because they're the two probably most dominant platforms, especially Linux. And the reason we do that, and I'm not sure if I've already said this once on Office Hours before, the reason we do that is that I think it makes sense in the sense that the developer release is all about getting the minimum viable product, get the components of the database that are production ready, get them out to you such that when we do go full 23C release, it's not like, oh my goodness, you've just had all this stuff shoved down your throat and then suddenly Oracle's saying, you should think about upgrading. That's a lot of pressure. And that's sort of what we almost did with 19C. We got it out to you, but it was the full release and we said, you should be upgrading. And people said, whoa, I haven't even downloaded it yet. So the aim of the 23C developer release was to get you stuff early so you could start to play with the database, learn how it works, see how things might have changed from 19C, etc. But it's not the full 23C release. The next one is cloud. And the reason we do cloud next is not because we're trying to force you to cloud. Everyone says, oh, you release cloud only because you're trying to force us to cloud. That's not the case. The reason we go cloud first is to minimize risk to both us and to you, the customers. Because when we go on cloud, we're deploying the software on exactly our platform, exactly our version of Linux, exactly our hardware. It's the most controlled platform we have. It's effectively the platform we build the product on and we're deploying it on. It's got the lowest risk of hitting regressions for customers. It's got the highest chances of being the most stable product. It's only once that's been in and bedded in for a while where we can more rapidly react to any regressions that we do encounter, that when we go to the general availability, which is obviously a much broader and more volatile environment, it's basically, oh yes, we're running Linux, but we're running this version of Oracle Linux. We're running this version of Red Hat Linux. We're running this version of Oracle Linux, but we haven't patched for a while. We're running Red Hat, but we haven't done this. Oh, I'm going to throw on Ubuntu, etc. The moment we go general availability, even if we just say we've released one platform, which is Linux, then yeah, the floodgates are open. There's a million platforms that are going to be used. So it'll be Linux first, general availability. I would say sometime, and this is purely guess on my part, sometime in the first half of next year, if I had to guess. I have no dates, and I'm not hiding anything from it. I literally don't know any dates, but if I had to guess, given that we did 23.2 in April, 23.3 in September, I'm guessing first half of next year for the next one. That would be Linux and Windows. And then after that would become the porting efforts. So that would be looking at AIX, Solaris, etc. So if I had to guess, I would say second half of next year. That's maybe me pessimistic, but that would be my guess as to when we would see the non-Linux ports, or basically the big iron ports of IBM, Solaris, etc. of 23C. That's my guess, and hopefully that answers that question for you. Second question, and I like this. We've got questions coming in that are basically from the audience. Second question coming in is, I'll paraphrase it so it sounds more like a question. We can use SQL macros to do dynamic SQLs, but are there any other real use cases? And most of the SQL macro demos you've probably seen out there are in the way we even build a SQL macro in terms of function. We are using a string to build an SQL statement, or if we're using a scalar SQL macro, we're using a string to build a snippet that gets embedded into a SQL statement. So there's obviously a strong overlap between dynamic SQL and SQL macros because we are dynamically building a SQL statement. However, I think the thing that's really going to set SQL macros apart, at least in the short term, is one of the things people have been crying out for literally decades, is the ability to pass parameters into views. And don't get me wrong, the vast majority of database views benefit from things like what we call predicate pushing, which is you do a query against the view, and then we grab that predicate and we manage to push it down into the source code or the source SQL that defines the view in order to get the maximum benefit from things like indexes, etc. But there's a whole stack of things where you literally can't push predicates down into views because of the way the view is defined. If you've got, say, an analytic function like a row number or a rank inside a view definition, then it's almost impossible to push a predicate down into it because that would change the actual results that come back from that row number or analytic function. Similarly, if you've got like a hierarchy query, you're doing a connect by prior start with, for example, you can't push a predicate into there because a where clause is different to, for example, nominating who you'd want to start with in a hierarchy. So one of the things that people have been clamoring for a lot of years is, wouldn't it be cool if you could have a view which actually took a parameter? So you could do select star from, for example, employment hierarchy, brackets, pass in where you want to start in the hierarchy, like the start with component. That's where SQL macros, I think, will really come into their own. I think the first sort of common usage will be using them to deliver parameterized views to people, because that's something that people have been crying out for a long time. There's all sorts of, I think SQL macros will be a bit like analytic functions. When analytic functions first came out way back in 8.1, we saw them used for ranking. Everyone goes, yep, I need a ranking sequence number as an extra column. And that was sort of the only thing we saw. And then over time, people started realizing, my goodness, there is so much flexibility, so much power. All of a sudden, I've got, running totals, moving averages, just so many variants of the things that we used to do in code because it was really hard to do in SQL. Classic example, median. I remember writing, ridiculously complicated SQL code just to do the median. And now we just do function median. It's an analytic that came, I think, around about Oracle 9. So I think SQL macros will be similar in the sense that they'll start off with the obvious use case, which is parameterized views. And then as people start exploring, they'll start seeing some really cool stuff in them. Please forgive me, I can't remember the full name, but I think it's Andre. Someone search for, I think it's Andre. I might have that wrong, but Andre and SQL Macros, he's a community member who's been doing a lot of work with SQL Macros, and he's already come up with some very powerful use cases. For example, pass in a query and get the result back as a CSV. So rather than having to rely on a tool like SQL CL or SQL Plus, etc., you might, or UTL file, you could have a database query that actually says select star from, pass in your query name, and out it comes as a CSV, for example, to send on to a data interchange, etc. So I think there'll be enormous power coming, but I think the first thing you'll see is parameterized views taking over the world. Okay. Cool, we got that. Okay, Narendra says, Oracle has removed populating the activity details in text format of the SQL monitoring report in 12.1. Any idea why it was removed and can it be reinstated? I didn't even know it was removed, but I'll ask around. Let me, I need to cut and paste that one so I don't lose it. Let me cut and paste that and I'll ask the people that own that and see what we can find out. Narendra, next question. Will 23C have a default value for the underscore cursor obsolete threshold reset to 1024 by default? Rest assured, I'm not going to give you an answer to that because that's an undocumented parameter and we don't talk about such things on office hours. If you want to talk about that, you'll need to contact me offline, but even then I might not answer it. We don't deal with those things. Best things, just my view is always leave parameters as the default or unless guided by support to do otherwise. I know that's a bit of a flippant answer, but yes, I don't like getting too much into the weeds of underscore parameters because I think it doesn't serve the community well. Okay. Oh, question now from Rachel. Have I done a video or a blog post on 19C initialization parameters? No, I have done neither. But I will talk about one thing in terms of initialization parameters. And I'll keep this fairly brief because it's not really answering your question. My view is whenever I'm building a database, whether I'm planning an upgrade or installing a new database from scratch, with the exception of the obvious ones, things like memory, etc., everything else, memory and sessions, everything else I am leaving absolutely default as much as I can. And then if I need to make adjustments over time because of certain things, like I might need to change, for example, open cursors, or I might need to change session case cursors, etc. Things like that, I'll make subtle adjustments. Sometimes it's like shared pool reserve size because I want to use, for example, more result caching than the database was initially thinking. But other than those things, which are small tweaks over time, I'm always starting with the absolute stock standard defaults. And if I'm upgrading from, say, 19 to 23 or 12 to 19, that target destination will commence with the absolute defaults. Even if I had a whole stack of specialized parameters in the previous release, I'm always starting with the defaults. And there's two reasons for that. One is, it's so easy to carry a lot of baggage. If you had a database that went 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, each one of them, you may have had some little tweaks to parameters and maybe even some, for example, events or fixed controls or underscore parameters that were advised to you by Oracle support and endorsed for particular purposes. Then it's so easy to say, oh, well, it was there. It's been there for 12 years. The guy who said it or the woman that said it left 5 years ago. We don't really know why. So it's one of those things where you sort of like, well, we better just keep it. I'm not a fan of that because it just becomes baggage, or it's like tech debt that you're carrying along over and over and over, something that I generally don't think is a good idea. So I'm always starting with the default and only changing is necessary. So that's the first one, removing that excess baggage. The second reason is, There's an old saying, which is, so many people like to be a pioneer, but they forget that most of the pioneers in the Wild West died. It was the settlers that came after them that actually, were the ones that prospered. And it's like, if you're running very much close to the defaults and you have a problem with your database, there's a very good chance that a whole lot of other people are having that problem, because a whole lot of other people are also running with the defaults. If you've got a slew of specialized parameters in your database and you start getting Oral 600s, then that's going to make your support experience worse, because the first thing that they're going to ask you is, can you reproduce this without that big swag of underscore parameters and specialized settings you've set? It's much better to be in the herd, in the big herd of people all running with the defaults or very close to the defaults, because the likelihood of you finding regressions that no one else has found already is very low. And also the likelihood of you being out for support, being able to help you quickly and efficiently, is much higher as well, because once again, they'll be able to reproduce your errors on the internal systems, which are probably all set to defaults as well. So that's my view on database initialization parameters, which is hopefully that helps. Okay, question in the chat. Okay, let me flick through the chat now. Okay. Yes, Judith has said you can use context variables as view parameters. But yeah, don't get me wrong, I actually have a video tip talking about exactly that. Not a huge fan of it, because it has always been a workaround to a piece of functionality that's been missing. But yes, at the moment, it's probably the only workaround to it. Rachel's asked, are SQL macros being backported into 19C? Yes, they are. We have two types of SQL macros. One's called a table SQL macro. Table SQL macros are where you're effectively generating an entire SQL that will become a query. And we have scalar SQL macros, which is you're generating a snippet of SQL. For example, if you had, let's say, if you want to find out the number of seconds between two timestamps, you have to use the extract function to find the hours. Extract the days, extract the minutes, and times these all by 86,400 for the days, 14,440 for the hours, etc., or 3,600 for the hours, 60 for the minutes, etc. You have to this very complicated expression to work out the difference in seconds between two timestamps. You might take that expression and nest it as a SQL macro in scalar form, so people can then use it more efficiently. So we have two types. SQL macros at table level have been backported into 19. I think they came in 19.12, or it might even be later. Might have been 19.16. They're all thereabouts. Rachel, you've said you're on 19.11. I'd strongly recommend you patch to the latest RUs. That's another topic, but yeah, I think we're up to 19.21 now. So hopefully everyone's on at least 19.18 or 19 or beyond. But SQL macros at table level are there. SQL macro scalars, I don't think there are plans to move them into 19. Who knows, given that 19's got another, how many years, 3-4 years, maybe at least of support yet. So, there's a lot that could happen in 3 to 4 years. But at the moment, I think the plans are purely for table macros to be in 19. Scalar macros plus table macros come in 23C. So Rachel's asked Judith the issue about bind variables and syscontext variables. When you have syscontext variables inside views to use them as predicates, you can get some issues with excessive numbers of cursors being used. And similarly, you don't get bind variable peaking inside a syscontext variable. So things like if you got skewed data or histograms, then you might not get the same benefits as a genuine bind variable. Narenda's got Mike Dietrich recommends cursorily obsolete threshold in his official presentations. Well, you should take it up with Mike then. Mike and I often butt heads on this. Yes, Jens, thank you for doing that. So blog.sqloracle.com is Andre's excellent blog site for a whole stack of very cool utilities he's written with SQL macros. So thank you for finding that. That's excellent. Okay, another question's come in. This is cool. We might not actually get onto the slides at all, which is awesome. In fact, what I should do is I'll stop the share. There we go. We can always come back to the slides. Carson said, Let me move this chat over here. Carsten said, why do autonomous transactions have the read consistency of the session? But if you use a one-time job in the same session, you'll see the real data state. This is the thing that I think Philip Sailberg posted out on Twitter. Yep, with the deletes of data. It's one of those interesting ones in the sense that, yes, that's an interesting test case he's put out there. However, I think we can sort of summarize this in even a broader sense. Forgetting autonomous transactions for a second is one of the constant things that people often forget is that even in something which is select from T where f equals 1, even if T is a one-row table, we can be reasonably confident that when you run something like that, the function will be executed once. But nowhere in the Oracle documentation do we say how many times we will run a PL/SQL function in the context of it being called from an SQL. So even putting the autonomous transactions aside for a second, it blows me away the amount of times people have a PL/SQL function in a SQL statement. And inside that PL/SQL function, it's referencing something like sysdate or systimestamp. And given that there is no rule for how many times a PL/SQL function will be executed per row in the context of a query, sysdate, for example, will change if it's referenced inside that PL/SQL function, because every time you call the function, you ask for sysdate, it's got no understanding of the fact that it's simply running within the bounds of a SQL statement. Whereas obviously sysdate inside a SQL statement is evaluated once, and once at the start of the query, and is fixed for the entire state of the query. So even putting aside the autonomous element, I think just the mixing and matching of PL/SQL functions in SQL needs to be done with enormous care. And I don't think a lot of us in the community take that due diligence. Now, when you throw an autonomous transaction into the mix, I think really you're sort of saying almost all bets are off. And I did sort of enjoy Philip's example in the sense that, yeah, you could get these, it's an interesting blend of multiple sessions plus the concept of what we call transaction write consistency, the concept of having to do restarts, which is effectively a multi-session issue when it comes to dealing with Oracle in terms of you want to get a read consistent view of some data, but if you're doing it within the bounds of an update, which is similar to a delete, then you read the data as when your query started. That's what a read consistent view does, but you then want to change the data as it is right now, even though you're now within the bounds of a query, which is doing a read consistent look. I'm not sure I have a video, but I do have a webinar which I've run, which is on read consistency, which talks about just read consistency and then the write consistency or transaction restart stuff. That probably gives you an idea that like that's a 1 hour webinar in which we talk about just those two topics. So maybe I probably can't cover all of this in one session today, but it's certainly worth noting that my general view is you just need to take enormous care when dealing with PL/SQL running within the realms of a SQL statement, and double up that care if that PL/SQL is, for example, doing DML via an autonomous transaction. I think it's generally something you want to steer clear of, unless you're coming up with niche cases like Philip was doing and demonstrating. Because putting those like special niche cases aside, the write consistency in Oracle is pretty cool in the sense that it takes care of these things all by itself. But yeah, once you start trying to bend it to meet your wills, I think you're generally going to get yourself into trouble. Okay, what else we got? Okay, Rachel's got, I ran into a situation where someone had done a bad clone, then restored the environment to a prior date. The sys password stopped working, but did work as system. I fixed it, but do you know why this happens? The most common reason for that is, even though when you use the sys password, it's stored in the data dictionary just like every other user in sys.user$. In fact, it's actually in a hidden table away, but effectively it's an internal dictionary table. It's also stored in the password file, which sits outside the database. And the reason we have to have a password file is because we need to be able to connect to sys when the database is down. What the most common thing I've seen is if you're restoring an environment, you can end up with a situation where the password file no longer matches what's in the data dictionary. So you get these interesting scenarios where, for example, you can connect to the system if it's down, but if you try connecting to the system while it's up, then you get password errors, etc. I'm not saying that's definitely the case, but that's a common scenario in the sense that if you're restoring a database, then make sure that generally it's not just the database itself. You may need to restore the SP file and the password file to a similar point in time. It's one of those things where people often don't change their sys passwords very often, and they never see this problem. But be aware that the concept of authentication is not just the database. It might be the database plus some external files as well. Narendra's saying, are there any plans to include a feature to allow Oracle to generate certain trace or hang analyze whenever a certain issue occurs? It becomes quite tricky to troubleshoot issues that occur intermittently. There are, one of the things, it really depends on what you mean by certain issue. If you go back in time, all the traces we used to do in Oracle were set with certain numbers. You do a 10046 trace, a 10053 trace, and if you're looking for any traces on errors, you would sort of set and do a trace with an error stack, and you'd set the error message number, and you could do it with an event spec in your init.org file. We totally rejigged the syntax for getting trace information. That's why nowadays, if you're doing a SQL trace, you don't necessarily have to do, for example, set 10046. You can actually do, I won't remember the syntax now, but I think it's alter system set events brackets SQL trace, and you can even nominate a particular SQL ID, such that when someone runs a certain SQL ID in the future, you'll automatically get a SQL trace. But there's a complete new set of syntax for carving up into what we used to have as you do with events. Now, unfortunately, that's all not documented. You have to go poking around Google-wise to see it. But I would be unsurprised, or in fact, I would be surprised if you couldn't actually capture the vast majority of issues that you're talking about with this new syntax, because you can bound it to certain errors, certain conditions. You can even have it sort of certain, if something happens under a certain number of recurrences, then we dump a trace, etc. Probably a good resource if you go hunting around for Tanel Poda's website. I know he's done some YouTube videos in the past in terms of how Aura Debug allows access to those kind of things, but also there's now alter system set events, and the new syntax allows a lot more flexibility in reacting to things as they occur. So maybe that's something that you could check out. Obviously, it's not in the official documentation, but yeah, I would be going around Google looking at some of Camille's work and Tanel's work, because they've done a lot of work in that area. Okie dokie. Okay, have I killed the crowd? Okay, are we done? Okay, I'll share the screen again. Okay, are we clear? Are we done? Okay, we'll move on. What do we got? 9:30. Oh, yeah, I think we can safely say we're not going to cover all 8 of these things, but not to worry. I thoroughly have enjoyed the interaction, and as I said, it's still open slather for the rest of the 60 minutes. If you have questions, feel free to throw them on. Okay, so this is the first one that we were theoretically going to talk about, new partition queries. Here's the question that came in. We use interval partitioning, and when a new partition is created, we find that queries do not run well against that partition because there are no statistics on that partition. Can we trap when a partition is added? And the answer to that is no. It's one of the things that is certainly on our radar because it's a very, very common request. People say, can't we have a database trigger? We already have things like an error trigger, and we have DDL triggers, etc. Wouldn't it be cool to have a trigger which is when a partition is added, can we actually fire some code? However, it's not too difficult to build a fairly simple workaround. And so I thought I'd show you some code, which I'll publish on a blog or in my GitHub repo at some stage in the near future. So anyone requiring this can simply grab it and customize it to their needs. So let's get that. Oops, didn't need caps lock. So we're going to start with a simple table here. I've got a table called T, it's partitioned, and I'm using list partitioning, but the same goes for basically interval partitioning, etc. I'm just using list because it's easy to do, but it's an automatic partition table, so same applies here. The insertion of data might dynamically create a brand new partition. Automatic partitioning for lists came in 12.2. So you can see it's got these values, so it's just from DBA objects, so it's going to have 6 partitions. If I gather the stats, we can actually know that the stats are now collected on those partitions. This is our starting position. The way we're going to implement something which is going to monitor for new partitions coming along is I'll establish a baseline first. This is my table called my previous copy of DBA partition tables, and it's table name and the number of partitions in each table. I'm just doing it for a single owner, but you obviously do it for your whole database. If you wanted, you can customize this as see fit. So I'm now going to insert into my list partition table a brand new object name and owner of 2 and A, which is basically going to give me a brand new partition. So if I go look at the user tab partitions, we can see because we gathered statistics, these are the 5 initial partitions and they have stats on them. Here's the dynamically created new partition, which we just created due to this, and there's no stats. And as you can imagine, if I'm doing queries across the entire table, they're probably going to be okay because the global stats are still there. But if I'm doing queries, for example, that use partition pruning, because we don't know what the stats are, or we're doing queries that maybe just access a couple of partitions, then we might get into a little bit of grief here because for all we know, there's not one row, there could be a million rows in here, and neither the global stats or the partition stats reflect that. So what do we do, given that we don't have a trigger that can capture that? So what I'm going to do is, as well as have a table here called T, which has created a new partition, something else might come along as well, which is a brand new table. You might create a brand new table also with effectively some partitions, and you haven't yet gathered stats on it yet. So we have 2 scenarios here. We might have brand new partitions in existing tables. We might have brand new partition tables for which we don't have stats yet. If you're on autonomous, it would come along every 15 minutes and pick this up for you. But if you're on your own system, then you want to see what's going on. And you probably don't want to run dbms stats, gather stats, even though it's stale, that kind of aggressively on your own systems, because we have some cheats in autonomous to make it nice and efficient. So I gather stats on T1. So this is the code I'm going to make available to you, which hopefully you find useful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to join my baseline, my previous copy of DBA part tables, and join it to the current copy of DBA part tables. So this is the last time I checked my entire system for what's on the system, and here's the current state. And I'll do an outer join, which means I'm picking up anything where we have a discrepancy between the last time I looked at DBA partition tables and right now. Now, if I can't find an entry in the previous copy of partition tables, then it's a brand new table that's arrived. And I insert a value in there such that I'm going to pick it up and remember it for next time. Otherwise, I'm going to loop through for all the partitions in these tables I've picked up and look for any entries where the number of rows is null. And that way I'm going to pick up any new partitions I've added since the last time I ran this program. And just to be safe, I'm saying, was this object created in the last last 60 minutes or so, just to make sure. I might have some, for example, say external partition tables that don't have stats on them. I don't want to repeatedly pick them up over and over and over. And so that tells me that, yep, what I'm going to do is if I find any, it means I've got a brand new partition name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find the previous partition name. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer here because in a interval partition table, which is typically things like a range partition table, we can be pretty confident that hopefully the previous stats are often representative of the next stats. If I've got daily partitions, then yesterday's stats are probably a good representation of tomorrow's stats, etc. This is a bit of a fake example because I'm using list partitioning, and you could maybe argue that the previous partition maybe has no relevance to this one, but I'm just keeping the example simple. And all we do is we say we're going to copy the stats from the previous partition to this partition, unless those ones are already null, and we wouldn't copy them because then we're just making the problem worse. And then we go through and then we update our previous thing, and we've now set a new baseline for where we are. So as I said, this is the baseline of code. You could make this as sophisticated and as complicated as you like, but this is just to show you a quick demo. So we create the procedure, and this is what would happen. As I said, we took a copy of DBA part tables initially. Then what do? We created a new partition in table T, and we created a brand new table T1. So partition T, it said, yep, I found this new partition. It was created at this particular time. So we'll copy the stats from the previous partition to this one to give you some representative stats. Now, you might choose to copy the stats. You might choose just to gather the stats. I'm a fan of copying, especially because it's very, very fast. And we also picked up a new table because there were stats for it. We simply updated our table called previous partition table, so we don't need to reference this table again. So I could run this job every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. It's relatively efficient because it's not doing anything in terms of gathering stats. It's just copying stats if it finds things to do. Therefore, if I run it again, this time it found nothing. So I could run that fairly aggressively every 5 minutes, every 1 minute, etc., depending on your environment, in order to always limit the amount of time a brand new partition has null stats. And what operation you choose to do, whether it's gather stats or copying stats, then it's your choice. But hopefully you're eliminating the amount of time that queries could go rogue during that point in time. One of the things I should say, the reason I'm a big fan of copy stats, especially for range partition tables, is it's pretty good. Like you can see, there's a lot of stuff in there. If it's hash, right, it uses that as it has rules for if it's a hash. If it's a list, it has various rules for list partitioning. If it's a range, it has also sorts, things like this. So one of the cool things you'll see with range partitioning is if your stats say that all the data here for yesterday's Wednesday's data, which was the 20th of December, when you copy those stats, it adjusts the high watermarks. It says, oh, well, by definition, these stats must be now for the 21st, not the 20th. So it's not just grabbing some stats from a random partition and say, jam them into place. It's trying to come up with an intelligent version of those copied stats. So copy stats is I think, underused facility when it comes to putting stats on large tables, which are typically partition ones. We're not spending a lot of time doing gather stats. Would have been awesome to allow Oracle to allow users to subscribe to events like automatic action. I agree, because one of our very cool infrastructures is event-based job scheduler. And like things like if you want to set things like when a job exceeds its duration, etc., you can be sent a little message saying, hey, guess what? Something's happening. So event-based and chains in job scheduler is a pretty cool facility. So it'd be good if we could hook other facilities inside our database onto it. I agree 100%. I would love to say that, because I've now read this and I agree with it, that it'll happen. But once again, I don't walk in those circles. I'd need to push that up to chain and get on my hands and knees. Okay, quick drink of water, 9:42. Okay, next one. Parsing well, I'll never get this right. This is something I don't want to say often. Parsing, let's just call them Excel files. We are using the Apex data parser to parse Excel files, but it is not fast enough for larger files. What are our options? Well, let's explore a few options. So if you haven't seen it, one of the cool things we have in Apex, and this is one of the reasons I recommend you should install Apex in every single database you have, even if you don't build Apex applications, which in itself I think is a mistake. But if you never plan on using Apex as a application environment, you should still install Apex because it comes with a whole stack of utilities, such as this one. So I create a table with a blob. I'm going to insert, this is a Excel spreadsheet with 50,000 rows. So I think it's about 10 megabytes on disk, but as you probably know, XLSX files are actually zipped or compressed. You can open them up with WinZip or 7Z. And so I think uncompressed, it worked out to be about 40 megs or so. So it's a reasonably large Excel spreadsheet. And so it's 5 megs, so 5 megs on disk, and it blows out to about sort of 40 or 50 megs when you expand it. So I'll set this running because then I can talk about what we're going. One of the things, this is how you do it. This is how easy it is to parse an Excel file in the database if you have Apex installed. We simply say, with this table called T, go get the blob from it and pass it into Apex data parser and parse it, tell it the file name so it knows from the extension what kind of file it is. And this is a pipeline function. So it's simply taking this, it's going to pipe you back the data as a CSV, effectively, nice and simple. In fact, as a relational table. And so you can actually go drag it out there. Now, one of the things that this is why I set this going, so I could talk while this was running. One issue you do have, which we're going to sort of pass over quickly, is you should know that Apex Data Parser has a threshold inside it, which is if the blob is less than 50 megabytes in size, we will just go basically work with a cached copy of it. It will work with it in memory. If it's larger than 50 megabytes, then we don't drag it into memory because, for all we know, it could be 10 gigs in size, and we don't want to drag 10 gigs into your PGA. That would be not a good idea. So by default, there's this 50 megabyte cutoff. If your file is less than 50 megabyte, we'll bring it into memory and make it relatively efficient. If it's larger than 50 megabyte, then we deal with the blob directly, which dramatically slows it down because we're trying to preserve memory. Now, if you're happy with the amount of memory you have, this is a workaround. You can say, take your blob and cache it as a temporary blob, and then use that. So even if your blob is larger than 50 megabytes, but you still want to slam it into memory, then you can do this as a workaround. But this was less than 50 meg. So even though we came up with, I think, 40,000, I'm just looking for a certain column, we came up with 40,000 of the 50,000 rows, it still took 35 seconds. Because Apex Data Parser is a PL SQL program, it's going to unzip your Excel file, and then it's going to walk through the data, trying to convert it into a relational format. It's a hard CPU burning process. So we're at 35 seconds. The question is, can we do better? Well, one of the cool things is if the database using PL SQL, which is ultimately about processing data as opposed to processing Excel files, if it's not the ideal tool for that job, well, find the tool that is. And here's an example. For example, Python. Python has some very simple code which lets you, say, take an Excel file and convert it to CSV. So here's a little batch program that would run it, where all I'm doing is I'm literally dumping a file out to dumping an Excel file to CSV into this file here, and then just piping it back to the calling environment. Because it's a little OS program that runs Python, and just for reference, this is how short the Python is. It literally is, check to make sure you're only passing in one file name, open up the workbook, and then write out the rows and the columns. Literally it's 5 lines of Python to dump out an Excel spreadsheet to CSV. But because we have a program that can run this, well, we can use an external table. So here's my Excel file. It's going to be an external table. I start listing all the columns. The Excel file is simply a copy of DBA objects, by the way. So you've got all these columns in there. And then here's the external part. I'm saying I'm going to use a preprocessor. The preprocessor will take my Excel file, run it through this batch file we just saw, which will run Python, which will take the Excel file, convert it to CSV, and then pipe the CSV back to the calling environment. And because it's now just a CSV, it's just the normal sort of CSV stuff, effectively delimited by, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a list of the columns. I nominate the date format. And now we can run this same thing. I'm now loading the Excel spreadsheet, turning it into CSV, piping it through an external table definition with a preprocessor, and then querying it. So Apex Data Parser was 35 seconds or 34.8 seconds. Let's see what this one takes. 18 seconds, so it's twice as fast. And the cool thing is, once you're into this thing of, well, it's all really about how quickly can I find an OS facility that'll do it for me? Well, for example, here's another example where I found a different set of Python. This is a different Python routine out there in some open source land, which does some different options, but basically it claims to be a slightly faster version. So I thought I'd give that a go. Here's my second copy of the table. Same thing, it's all the same, except I'm running a different batch file around that, and we give it a run. So we went from 34 seconds down to 18 seconds. And let's see how this one goes. And we're down to 9 seconds. So we're almost 3.5 times faster. So ultimately, what am I saying here? Really, it's about finding the right tool for the right job. The very fastest way of giving an Excel spreadsheet to a flat file is actually using C#. And I've seen some posts where you can actually use C# because obviously Excel itself is probably written in C#. You can use C# to bring in some Excel libraries to simply read the file and send it straight off to CSV or just flat text, etc. I'm not a C# person, so I wasn't going to build one of those. But even so, if you pick the right tools for the jobs and utilize the enormous power of external tables now that there's that preprocessor option, you'll be amazed how quickly you can process files. Very, very cool. And I'm not saying don't use Apex Data Parser. The reality is, if someone's loading up enormous spreadsheets via Apex, then that sounds like an odd requirement to me. I'd be going to visit that person and saying, is this a one-off thing? Then we'll use some, say, SQL Loader. If it's a regular thing, why are we loading that volume via Excel? Surely there's a better data interchange mechanism we should probably be exploring. But either way, Apex Data Parser is fine for smaller Excel spreadsheets, but if they get large, you can simply work around it with something like this. You just said, what about using Excel itself to save the file as CSV? Yes, you can do that. But generally what I find is the case is people want their database or people want their applications to do the heavy lifting for them. Generally, customers deal with Excel spreadsheets. And if you say to them, look, would you mind saving it as CSV before you're sending it to us? That's when you start getting friction and pushback. I'm in the corner of, hey, send us the data as we'd like to have it. But ultimately, our job as IT professionals is typically reducing the amount of hoops that customers have to go through, and we're the ones that should be taking on the heavy lifting. So that's, I think, why people like the ability to simply say, here's my Excel spreadsheet, show it to me in Apex, show it to me in a database, etc. How are we going? 9:51. We might skip this one because it's a lengthy one. Okay, this one's not so long. Let's do this one, and then we'll wrap it up. Hybrid partitions. We are looking at using hybrid partitions for old data as a means of reducing our table size footprint. Are there any restrictions we need to know about? And I said yes. One of the things that's in the documentation is we have the restrictions on hybrid partition tables, but most of these are, I wouldn't say significant in the sense that they make a lot of sense. Like you'd say, I can't have a reference partitioned hybrid partition table. And that makes sense because reference partitions are all about two tables being joined together. How do you get a foreign key between two flat files? It makes no sense. You can't have unique indexes or global unique indexes because you can't have a unique key on a flat file. You can have partial indexes, right? Which means you can index the relational part of the data, but you can't have a unique index where half the data is outside the database. So if you go through most of these things, they all make sense. They're actually not what I would call significant restrictions. You can't have DML on the flat files. Wow, you're kidding. So, etc. Most of this stuff makes sense. However, that doesn't mean there aren't a couple of gotchas you do need to be aware of, which sometimes can come back and bite some people. So I thought we'd fly through those, and that'll be our last bit thing for tonight. But hopefully this also shows you a demo of just how cool this facility is, especially as a way of archiving. And if you're, for example, on, say, Express Edition, and your database is getting close to 12 gigabyte, you have all the partitioning facilities available to you because you have all the Enterprise Edition options in Express Edition. So you could use this as a way of letting your database go beyond 12 gig by having a lot of read-only stuff in the hybrid partitions. So here's an example. Here's the sales table. I've got 3 partitions, 18, 19, and 20. So I've got yearly partitions, and it's not exactly the most dynamically populated table. I've only put like a certain number of rows in there, just a few rows here and there, but it doesn't really matter. If I want to, for example, allow this table to become a hybrid partition table, I can add some external attributes, which a hybrid partition table is actually probably best thought of as an external table that has some internal or relational tables as opposed to the other way around. So I'm going to add external partition attributes. They're going to be data pump files, and we're not going to have log files. So for example, now I can add a new partition. I had 17, 18, and 19 before. I can add a new partition, which is going to be 2020. So this is perhaps reversed. This is the newest data is going to be effectively a hybrid partition. So let's talk about gotcha number one. One of the things is you cannot add a hybrid partition at the early end of the table. It's not allowed. So if you have an existing table of partitions and you want to add partitions, you have to add to the front, which is obviously typically not what you want to do. Typically, it's the older partitions you want to put in as hybrid ones. The reason you can't do that with a range partition table is obviously the lowest range goes back forever, and therefore there is really no starting point. The earliest range is always a value is less than, and so there really is no starting point, and therefore we can't add a hybrid partition. So that's one of the things that you can't just go add one. The only way you can do it is by exchanging. So if we look, you can see I got 3, 17, 18, 19, which is normal. I managed to add one at the top end, external. That's fine. That's allowed. So it's read only and external, but I can't add one for 2016. If I want to build an older partition that was originally relational and now move it to hybrid, it's actually very easy to do, which is really cool, which is I simply say, here's my table 2018 dump one. And it simply is an Oracle data pump copy of that partition. I don't have to actually use data pump to get it out. I actually use this. I say it's an external table I want you to create. So this is writing a dump file as a copy of this partition. Once I've done that, I simply exchange. This is how I take old data and convert it to a hybrid partition. I do create table as select. That creates a dump file version, and then I flip the dump file with the relational version. And now I have my hybrid partition. So we can see now that sales 2018 has become read-only and it's external. So this is how we do the old data. You have to use exchange. That brings us to gotcha number 2. What if I go back the other way? So I took my relational data, I unloaded it to a dump file, and then someone said, oh, I need to make a small maintenance change to it before it goes back to a read-only version. So we flip it back in, make our modification, right? Well, I'm about to make that modification. This is the second gotcha you need to be careful of. Even though you've taken a read-write table and converted it to a read-only hybrid partitioned, when you flip it back the other way, it stays read-only. So yes, it's back to being a normal partitioned object, a normal relational object, but it's still read-only. So that concept of flip it back in to make a change, you'll get an error. So just be aware of that. You actually need to do the explicit read-write in order to make it read-write, make it a change, and then you can flip it back out to being a data pump copy again. So just to be worthy of note there. Let's create an index on this table now, indexing partial, because remember you can only create partial indexes, a couple of indexes here. And this is gotcha number 3. The most common thing we want to do when we're doing exchange partition, merge partition, drop partition, etc., is update the indexes such that the table stays online during the operation. As it currently stands, and I'm told the team is looking at this, if you try to do an exchange partition out to a hybrid partition data pump file and update the index at the same time, you get this unimplemented feature. This is in version 21, you get it in version 23 as well, but I think the plan is to actually fix this in 23C. So unfortunately, you have to do without update indexes, so it works, but of course, then you've got an unusable index that needs to be rebuilt. So just be aware of that. So you can see these 2 indexes after the exchange have become unusable because they were partial indexes, and you would need to rebuild them. The last gotcha, what have we got time? Oh, we're running out of time. The last gotcha is typically, let's create a table which has no hybrid partitions initially. So I'm going to create a table. I'm going to use generated identity. So I've got a primary key, which is just a sequence number, and there's my data. I stick some data in just as before. I want to now do the same thing. I want to flip effectively one of these partitions out to a data pump version. So I do my alter this, create that alter as sales tables out there. So I've now got a data pump copy of this relational partition. Here's gotcha number 4. If I try to do an exchange, I want to flip it out. I can't. Now, why is that the case? Well, a Oracle data pump file as an external table can't have generated as identity on its clause. That makes no sense because it's a flat copy. So I'm trying to exchange a partition table which has generate as identity as its column definition with one that doesn't, and it won't let me. And there's no workaround for this. So you need to be incredibly careful if you're going to use identity columns because you immediately block this feature from working. So just be aware of that. That's our last gotcha. We're done. Great. And thank you so much for those people that leapt in and threw things in the chat and etc. Obviously, it's perhaps not as interesting me just talking answers as opposed to showing demos and stuff like that. But certainly I think it makes it more interactive, makes it more fun, and also, helps, puts me on the spot. Hopefully it makes me earn my living a little bit more. So just one more thing in order to wrap it up. I just want to say, thank you so much everyone for their support during the year. If I haven't managed to see you face to face at a conference, I'll do my absolute best in 2024. One of the things I should always show is, let me close off the share. This is a tradition we always do it on the last office hours of the year. Now, someone told me that every bottle in the world has 6 twists. I'm not sure if that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There you go. If you find a bottle that doesn't do 6 twists, let me know. But as always, we want to hope move the keyboard out of the way, maybe. Whoa! Hey. All by itself. There we go. So hopefully you'll join me at least in a virtual toast. Thank you for your office hours contributions this year. Thank you for being on these sessions. I hope you've had a fantastic year in whatever IT exploits you've been after. Next year will be a great year. We'll have the full release of 23C. There'll obviously be more Apex releases and obviously more office hours, more Ask Tom, etc. So thank you so much for being involved in any community work I've done this year. And hopefully I'll see you all again next year as well. Have a safe and happy holidays. If you're in troublesome parts of the world, please stay safe. As I always say, the only way we should lose members of the community is if they retire, and no other way. So Merry Christmas, everyone. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next year for office hours. Let's see what that cork did to my roof. Anyway, bye for now, everyone.